Welcome to Off Script with Dan Dwyer on Robin Hood Radio, featuring in-depth interviews with guests from the world of theater and allied arts. Underwriting support from Johnny Cake Books in Salisbury, Connecticut, whose collection of rare collectible and out-of-print books is housed in a 19th century cottage in one of the most old-fashioned small towns in New England. And now, here's the host of Off Script, Dan Dwyer.
Well, thank you, Marshall. It's Christmas time, and everything gets into the Christmas season, including theater. At the top of the heap, of course, is the big Radio City Christmas Spectacular, and at the local level, there's middle schools all across the country that are doing Christmas pageants. And in between, regional theaters typically default to a tried-and-true perennial version of Dickens' Christmas Carol. But others stage something quite different, and that's the case at Ancram Opera House. In keeping with its very distinctive artistic program, Ancram Opera House is presenting an original musical adaptation of The Snow Queen, based on one of Hans Christian Andersen's most beloved fairy tales. It's running in a stage concert version for just 6 performances on weekends starting Friday, December 6th, and ending Sunday afternoon, December 15. With me today in the studio is the Ancram Opera House co-director and actually the director of The Snow Queen, Jeff Mousseau, and by phone, the playwright and poet, Barbara Wiechmann, who adapted Andersen's famous story for this production. Barbara, welcome.
Oh, thank you. Nice to be here.
And Jeff, too.
Hey there, Dan. Good to see you.
Good to see you. So, Jeff, let's start with you. The Snow Queen is one of the best Hans Christian Andersen, one of the best-known Hans Christian Andersen fables. But how did this come about, and how did you work it into, you do one December program every year. Why this one?
Well, as you just sort of said, we wanted to figure out a way to present something for the during sort of this holiday season that wasn't a Christmas Carol. And Barbara and I have actually been working on this piece for a number of years, and this became very clear to us that this was the perfect opportunity to sort of come back to this piece, revisit it. Barbara and I had started working on this like 5 or 6 years ago, where we had been able to do some developmental work with the piece at the Kennedy Center as part of a residency there, and then at Here Art Center in New York, and then finally with some students at Siena College. But this was all about 5-6 years ago. We put the piece to the side for a bit of time. In the meantime, Paul Ricciardi, my partner, we opened the Ancram Opera House, and when we opened up the Opera House, I sort of knew in the back of my mind that this would be something we would want to kind of come back and begin working on again. So in the last 6 months to a year, Barbara and Lisa Dove, who's the composer, we have been meeting up intermittently about once a month to revisit each section of the show, looking at new material and developing the piece some more, so that we were to lead up to this presentation that we're doing now.
That's great. Hey, Barbara, before you get into the specific aspects of your specific adaptation, for those of us who've been removed from children's lit for a while, could you briefly tell our listeners what The Snow Queen is about?
Sure. The Snow Queen is about 2 children who are great friends as childhood friends, and the little boy gets pierced in the eye and in his heart by a wicked piece of glass from a mirror the devil has created, and it sort of corrupts him, and he gets abducted by this very sort of seductive figure, the Snow Queen, and he flies away with her to her palace. Everyone in town thinks he's dead, but his childhood friend believes he is not. And she goes on a journey to find him and to rescue him. She doesn't know where he is. And the Snow Queen is basically about her journey to rescue Gerda, is a little girl, to rescue her friend Kai, not even knowing where he is or if he's alive, but she believes that he is because she loves him.
So it's really got a story, a typical story tale, fairy tale kind of narrative structure, but you're really suggesting it's got some very, very dark elements.
Yes.
What's the challenge of incorporating those into a stage adaptation that's going to be entertaining and also thematic?
Well, I think, I was a huge fan of Andersen's fairy tales when I was a little girl. He was maybe my first big literary influence. I read them all, and his stories are often very dark. That didn't bother me at all as a child, and I believe that children, to some extent, really can accept that. Also, because in his stories, there's good, there's evil, they exist together. Children kind of are on board with that, I think. I don't think that they need everything to be sweet all the time and nice. And so that, I know often parents are concerned with some fairy tales as being too dark or too gory, but children have an innate sense of justice and morality, and that's actually what I loved about them. They're very psychological stories. They're very emotional stories, Andersen's stories. And I also think they're entertaining. This is an adventure story in a way. But Andersen himself, who, gave his stories to children all the time, and sometimes in public readings and, in living rooms and things, also said that he left something for the adults, that he wanted the adults to have something to listen to and be entertained by, too. So he was already thinking of a broad spectrum of audience, not just tiny children.
In case you're just joining us, the program is Off Script. I'm your host, Dan Dwyer, and my guest today is Jeffrey Mousseau, who's directing a new original musical adaptation of The Snow Queen at the Ankrum Opera House, and with him by phone is Barbara Wiechmann, who adapted Christian Andersen's famous story. Barbara, which translation did you use when you started doing adaptation, or did you use a lot?
That's a good question. Yeah. I used a lot of them, really. One of the things that interested me was that the story is broken up into 7 different small chunks or chapters or mini stories, and I liked that structure. But many translations sort of, by the time that Gerda finds her friend Kai and rescues him, and they're able to leave the Snow Queen's palace, it's sort of a normal thing that she's taken some time to do this, but now they're rescued. In a few of the translations, it appears that she's spent her entire life on this pursuit, and that now both she and Kai are very old, but children at heart. And that's what actually interested me. So those few translations where it actually talked about them being old people and that she gave up her entire life to save her friend was quite beautiful to me. And that's actually what inspired me to choose that story as one to adapt.
Right. Because
it was very, very moving to me that we all give up our lives in pursuit of something, for love or for whatever our passions are.
Before I ask Jeff about the music, you've done, besides the book, which is the adaptation of the story itself, you've also done the lyrics. So what kind of language, what kind of rhythm, what kind of sensitivity have you brought both to the spoken parts, the book parts of the play, as well as the music?
Well, I think in a way this is not necessarily I don't even know what a typical musical would be, but it's not necessarily a book and then songs.
So is it more like a chamber musical sung through?
And the language I use when I'm writing to begin with is kind of, it would be called heightened language, poetic language. And so hopefully that I thought of song as just one more rung up the ladder in heightened language, and that the whole thing sort of flows as one piece rather than narrative and then song. That it all there's music underneath a lot of the regular narrative. There's times where there might be sort of a pure song, and then there's times where the dialogue is sung almost like a little fairy tale opera in a way.
Nice. A sort of a variation, or would it be pretentious to say a variation of a chamber musical?
Yes, that's probably a good definition. Yes.
Good. Jeff, tell us about the music. We've heard from Barbara now about the kinds of sensitivities that she used in composing the language for lyric and book. What kind of music are we going to hear?
I mean, I wish Lisa Dove, the composer, was in the room right now to sort of answer that question, because she could do it much more justice than I can. And maybe Barbara could even jump in on this.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like in some ways that she, first of all, Lisa really touched down into Barbara's text in the lyrics that she wrote to create a score that really amplifies and lifts up the imagery, the feeling, the emotion of that the words are communicating. And then I think the second piece of this is that she sort of also tapped into the character. So it's a lot of, I think the music is ultimately an expression of the character who is singing it. So it is of that voice or of that feel. And and then, I think there's also just an element of her threading this entire piece together musically. And the production that folks will be seeing, it's a trio of a piano, cello, and violin. And so I think it's actually really perfectly suited for this sort of story, song telling experience that we're building.
So, Barbara, the obvious and cliched question is, which came first, the chicken or the egg? And the answer is both, right?
So, Jeff and I had decided to adapt. We had worked on another sort of original ghost story piece together called Aunt Leaf that we were really happy with, and we decided to adapt something else. And so we looked around, decided to adapt The Snow Queen, worked on that, and then we engaged Lisa, whom I had worked with at New Dramatists at a playwrights at a composer librettist studio. I met Lisa and thought she was wonderfully talented and exciting, and we had worked on a long sort of Irish fairy tale piece together. It was like a 15-minute song we did together. And so I thought she would be wonderful for this, and I think she is wonderful for this. Her music is really unique and just really exciting to me. She, I think it's been really wonderful and gratifying to work with her, so the text, the idea for it came first, and then we brought Lisa on board.
Great. So, Jeff, as the director, you make this reel with all of its practical elements up there on the stage. The first thing I observed going through the program is that, dare I say, this is the largest cast you've put on the Ankrum stage?
Absolutely.
I went because usually your productions have 1
to 3,
three people.
3 has been
and
our
if you had
largest.
a band, maybe 5, and
Correct.
you've got 10 players.
Yes.
Plus 3 musicians.
Yes.
That's huge for the opera house.
Absolutely.
And we should mention, for this particular production, I gather the way you've designed the space, and we can talk about that too, only 60 seats, so it's going to be a very intimate experience.
That's correct. I mean, that's one of the things we love. What Paul and I really loved about the Opera House when we first started working in programming there is that it has such, you are just so connected and intimate with the performer, and the audiences with the performer, and vice versa. So yeah, by far, this is the largest piece we've ever undertaken, and I mean, it's to the point that we're asking our neighbors where performers can park their cars so that we're not taking up the parking lot. So we have room for the audience members to come. But so yeah, we're excited about it. It's definitely stretching us in many, many ways. But
are all the performers from the region, or some from New York City, or
it's
where?
a mix. I mean, and that was another thing we were really actually consciously pursuing with this production, because it is a larger cast. And also not wanting to be the theater company that is only working with folks from out of town. We really wanted to create an opportunity for our local audience, our local artists, actors, performers, to have an opportunity to work with us, and for us to work with them. And so a good number, I'm not exactly sure how many, but at least half of the performers live within driving range of the Opera House. And then we do have a couple folks that are coming up from the city. Brian DeMar Jones, actually, who was in The Brother Size this past summer as part of the company.
Which character did he play?
He played Alegba, the friend.
Oh, right.
So the sort of the troublemaker.
The real troublemaker, yeah.
And then James Aquino, who was in our very first theater production at the Opera House in 2015, maybe, is that right? In the American premiere of In Praise of Elephants. So he's coming back. Sarah Edkins, who's doing the set design for the show, designed the set for the Brothers' Size. So it's a great cohort of some returnees, some New York City folks, and some performers from the community.
For those that didn't see the Brothers' Size, it really was one of the best productions of in New England among summer theater or regional theater of last season. A marvelous production.
Thank
and
you.
what the designer's name again?
Sarah Edkins. Yeah.
Edkins did a marvelous
Yeah.
work with this space, which was intimate to begin with, but she did this very novel kind of thrust stage into the audience. Now, the word has it out there that the set design this time is really kind of spectacular too.
It is. She's amazing. She's just a
Is
really,
it one big snowflake?
I would say I suppose you could see it that way. It's really a series of fragments of what could be snowflake or ice. Or
paper cutout.
Or paper cutouts. The sort of the source idea behind it all was that, in addition to being this amazing, prolific writer, Anderson was also a very talented paper cutter. So he would often spend time doing these intricate paper cuttings. He called it scissor writing, and so we totally caught into that idea. And so that sort of became an inspiration for character in terms of sort of a way into the show, as well as a visual element for the show.
Did Sarah go back actually and do research into Christian Anderson? Any examples that are left over in archives or online about his cutouts?
Yeah, I mean, we all sort of looked at that stuff. There's online materials and there's a publication. There's a really lovely book that has his paper cutouts in them as well.
Great.
Yeah.
So, Barbara, when Jeff was just describing the set design and it being fragments of, that goes back to one of the kernels of the story that you mentioned, where the mirrors splatters.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Want to talk
and
about
Sarah's really wonderful. Sarah's done almost every single set for any show I've ever done, and so I've worked with her a long time. And what's really wonderful about Sarah is that she, in the beginning when you start talking to her about design, she'll ask questions that, like in the case of when Jeff and I worked on Leaf, she asked a question that actually sort of dictated some dramaturgical things about the play that we couldn't solve. So she's really wonderful in kind of thinking about the whole play in terms of dramaturgy and visuals and character and all of those things.
Well, what you're describing to me, it sounds like more of the British model of producing a play rather than the American model. In the American model, the playwright gets together, maybe with the director, and they come up with a script, and then they bring in the set designer. In England, everybody's there from the get-go. In terms of it, more often than not. That's kind of a distinctive approach. Is that just a function that you're all good friends and you've been working on this for so long and, invention's the mother of necessity or vice versa?
I think it's all of the above. We're all, we have the group conversations from time to time, but then there's the one-offs, and because we have worked with, in this case, Sarah, over a couple, this is Aunt Leaf and now this, that earlier incarnation at Siena with the Snow Queen with Sarah. There's a lot of, I think, just sort of trust that we all have with one another. The thing about Sarah that I wanted to just mention, in terms of the design too, is I sort of think of her as sort of like it's an installation that she's actually ultimately building in the space, and she's there right now this afternoon, sort of putting some final tweaks and touches to this space. In preparation for tonight's invited dress.
I'm sure. Before we get into the last batch of questions, I just wanted to remind our listeners the program's off script. I'm your host, Dan Dwyer. My guests are Jeff Mousseau, who is the co-director of the Ancram Opera House and the director of its winter performance called The Snow Queen, which is going to be performed on the weekends starting Friday, December 6th and concluding Sunday afternoon, Sunday, December 15th. And with him by phone is Barbara Wiechmann, a playwright and a poet who adapted Hans Christian Andersen's famous story. In terms of it being an installation, how do you build it? Where do you build it? And you just, from paper to up there and it looking fabulous, integrating the story and making the thematic point, that's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work, but it's, because we don't have a shop, so it's built on site, and it actually and Sarah works on one hand, Sarah has drawn this all out, and the actual where we land isn't too far afield from where she started, but there's a lot of decisions that she makes along the way while we're in this space together. And we're all in and out of the space while she's working. So little questions come up about a particular position or the shape of one of these fragments in the case of the design here. So it can also happen very kind of fluidly with a fluid, organic pace, which is kind of great.
Now, the performances that people will see for the next 2 weekends are what you describe as a concert version. For people who aren't familiar with stage concert versions of original musicals, give us a clue of what they'll be seeing.
So some of it is performed score and script in hand, and but it's also as we've been talking about, there's a production. There are production elements. It's costume. There's the set design. It's lit. But it's still, a work that's being developed. But by intent, because it is a storytelling piece, the element of storytelling and song telling is the new coined word I'm coming up with right now. But the idea of that being part of the mode of communication here, the expression. Also, the trio that I was talking about earlier, they're on stage, fully visible, right. Part of the production, part of the ensemble. So it has that's the sort of the presentation style and format that we've.
One of the most satisfying things of going to the theater is that it gives a theatergoer an experience of witnessing theater, of experiencing something theatrical that you don't get from reading a book, that you don't get from playing the score and sitting there in your living room. I have both of you here, the book writer and the director. What is the most theatrical element of what you've either written or what you've staged or together you're trying to achieve in this production?
Wow. Okay. Barbara, go ahead.
I will say that I this is the first time I've heard you call it a song telling, but I love that
too. I think that's great. I'm going to use that in the future.
Yeah, I think that's sort of right, and that's what we've talked a lot about the stuff that we want to make together, and I think that we always. And you feel free to jump in and contradict me or say whatever, but the idea of listening is really important to me as a writer. And if you had to just give the piece just to hear it, that's very important to me. Now, Sarah does these incredible visual things which add to the experience in this fantastic way, and we have this wonderful lighting designer. But I think, even with the Opera House, the idea of making theater that you can really listen to and pay attention to in that way is very important to me anyway.
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the things is that we are trying to reach sort of a intergenerational audience with this piece. And I think,
yes.
In the way Barbara was talking about how Goethe, it takes a lifetime, that's sort of the idea that it takes a lifetime for Goethe to rescue Kai. In that journey that she goes on, she has encounters with various assorted characters of different ages. And I feel like the idea of aging and where you are at different points in your life, and it speaks to audiences of different ages as well. So I'm really interested in how that plays out.
Barbara, off-the-wall question. Did you read Jeff's director's statement in the program yet?
No, I have not.
I don't think she has.
Oh, well, I'm going to ask Jeff about it because it's a really remarkable statement. You wrote it on the day of the big snowstorm that dumped record amount of snowfall for this time of year particularly, all up and down the Hudson Valley. And Jeff has put 3 paragraphs together that are really, really poignant about how the play and making of the play relates to the unforeseen circumstances of life. So I'm going to throw that at you and let you go with it to close us out.
Well, I'm not going to read or blow the statement on the air, but one of the things that's interesting about working with Barbara, we're of the same age, and don't ask how old we are, but we often have, as part of our collaborative process, we're often sort of checking in about what's happening in our life at given moments in time. And so the sort of the ups and downs that we all encounter are, I think, is embedded in this play and so that to me is exciting to sort of have this this performance experience.
You're too modest. I'm going to read the opening. I'm going to read the opening paragraph of your director's statement in the program because I really think it's poignant. And it's dated December 2nd, which was the day of the big snowstorm. And it says, "Snow is falling heavily in Ankrum today, disrupting rehearsals and tech prep for the Snow Queen. The irony is not lost on me. All of our planning has been upended in the face of this early December storm. As much as we try to map life out, how much control do we really have? How much do we choose the path we find ourselves on? These are the questions asked in this new staged adaptation of The Snow Queen." Barbara, what do you think?
Jeff, that's fantastic.
Well, the denouement of the story is that I wrote that like for 4 a.m. I couldn't sleep. I'm like, this show. I'm like, what is going on here?
Well, I think it's brilliant, and I want to thank you both for coming on, Barbara by phone, and congratulations on what I'm really excited to see tomorrow night, and Jeff, congratulations too for all the work that you've done. In case you have been listening, once again, The Snow Queen, an original musical adaptation of Hans Christian Andersen's fabled fairy tale, will be performed at the Ankrum Opera House for 3 performances each on the weekends of Friday, December 6th, and then ending Sunday, December 15th. Thanks again to Barbara and Jeff for being on the show. Until the next time, I'm going to wish you a Merry Christmas and or a happy recognition of the season, no matter how you see it. Till the next time, take care.
Underwriting support for Off Script with Dan Dwyer from Johnny Cake Books in Salisbury, Connecticut, whose collection of rare, collectible, and out-of-print books is housed in a 19th century cottage in one of the most old-fashioned small towns in New England. Off Script with Dan Dwyer is also available via podcast on our on-demand page, robinhoodradio.com. Click on On Demand, and then click on Off Script with Dan Dwyer.